Thank you again, Mimi, for joining us and joining the SAAG Anthologies series of interviews that we're doing with a lot of different artists, writers, activists. For our audiences, I'd love to get started and with your introduction. Mimi Mondal is a Hugo and Nebula Award-nominated author of science fiction and fantasy and a columnist, writing about history, politics, technology, and futures. Her novelette, His Footsteps Through Darkness and Light, was shortlisted for the Nebula Award in 2020. Her first book, Luminescent Threads, Connections to Octavia E. Butler, co-edited with Alexandra Pierce, received the Locus Award in Nonfiction and was shortlisted for the Hugo Award in Best Related Work and the British Fantasy Award in Nonfiction, among others. Mimi is also a founding board member of Plurality University Network and a juror for the Crawford Award. She is a recipient of the Immigrant Artist Fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts in 2017, the Octavia E. Butler Scholarship for the Clarion West Writing Workshop in 2015, a Commonwealth Shared Scholarship at University of Stirling in 2013, and the Poetry with Prakriti Prize in 2010. So she's written extensively on all manner of things, from both in sci-fi and fantasy, as well as columns about being a Dalit woman, Indian fantasy genres, the Me Too movement in India, and a lot more. So that's such a long list of achievements. So Mimi, thank you again for joining us. And I'll just get started with the most basic of questions is, could you tell me a little bit about your start with sci-fi and speculative fiction specifically, and who inspired you to get into this kind of writing?
I guess I got into speculative fiction writing in a much in a staggered way, let's say. So I grew up in Calcutta in India, and Calcutta, so Bengali literature is what I read as a child. And Bengali has a lot of genre fiction, and I mean, a lot of it is not even considered genre fiction, but it also has like a large body of young adult literature, and it has detective and science fiction and horror, which are being written by the same authors who are also writing realism. Like pretty much every Bengali author has written a ghost story, including Rabindranath Tagore. Like his ghost stories are pretty famous. They've been like turned into movies and so on. So so I grew up in an environment which I guess is like, you know, it's familiar to a lot of other South Asian cultures as well. It may be familiar to the Urdu culture, where you don't really make a segregation between the genre fiction kind of story as opposed to the realism kind of story. And I read that, but then that was supposed to be childhood reading. And when I moved to, like, you know, high school and college, there was suddenly literature was all realism. It was all old British literature, and then post-colonial literature which came out of that. And suddenly people were not super talking about, like, genre fiction was not in that field anymore, right? And that's when I guess I latched on to magic realism, which was coming up right at that time. I grew up in the late 90s and 2000s. So latched on to Salman Rushdie, Garcia Marquez, and so I liked the speculative stories. I just didn't know that you could write science fiction fantasy in India, because our market was not always reading it, or they were not always talking about it. There was an author called Samit Basu, who I really, really like. And his books came out when I was in high school. And he himself was pretty young at that time. Like, he was in his early 20s. He was a young published author. And he was pretty much the first Indian author to be writing like science fiction fantasy as a genre in English. And so many of us, like young school students, etc., you know, early college students, were super excited by that, because we didn't know you could do that. So, but then, I mean, his first trilogy did very well. He has always been like a, you know, really interesting, really amazing writer. But I mean, not many others came up in like a pretty long time after him. And like, we could see Samit Basu staying a novelty even after years of getting published for the first time and so on. Like, you know, he was going into all these conferences and talking about what is science fiction fantasy again and again. So yeah, I mean, so I guess like I went through all those years, like 7 or 8 years of like doing other things. I was an editor at Penguin India for a year, and I was editing, literary fiction as usual. So I went through like a lot of different other professions, not really thinking that I would be writing science fiction fantasy. And then I was in the UK as a grad student, and I had a couple of friends who were writing science fiction short stories, and they were reading the foreign science fiction magazines. So that's when I started writing for those magazines, like hoping that I would be able to submit to them. And I guess like that was a turning point.
So could you tell us a little bit about Samit Basu's work? What about it stood out to you? And also a little bit more about some of the Bengali authors you grew up reading. Did you end up ever drawing from their work when you eventually started writing yourself?
I think I draw from them a lot more than I originally acknowledged, because what I realized is that when you read a certain canon, like I came out of the, university English syllabus post-colonial literature canon, sometimes your narrative becomes that. So I wasn't initially acknowledging the science fiction fantasy authors that had also influenced my writing, because I was thinking of myself in the tradition of literary fiction authors. So one of the authors that I read a lot, Satyajit Ray, who most people know as the filmmaker. Like I came to the US, I realized that even the people who have like watched his films have not read his science fiction or his detective fiction, which was Feluda, which was a series. I certainly read a lot of Tagore. I went to a school which was Tagorean, like as opposed to any kind of religious missionary or Hindu religious. And now that India has gone like super right wing, I feel super grateful that I went to a Tagorean school, like a school that idolizes a literary figure. It's so much better than the school that idolizes a lot of other things.
So moving a little bit forward, could you talk about, you worked as an editor in India, in Indian publishing. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences trying to sort of, if at all, if you had any at all, but working on getting published in South Asian spaces? How did like people react to your work and writing in the publishing industry in South Asia generally?
My work is still pretty much read in South Asia and within South Asian communities, I think. Like, even though I'm in American science fiction and fantasy, which is a very insular industry in a way, like it doesn't actually interact with the American literary fiction industry that much. But I think most of my work, and I mean, even the fact that I'm doing this interview, I think my work is largely read by South Asians, South Asian Americans, like South Asians in other spaces. And when I started writing in India, I wrote poetry for a very long time, and I would not encourage excavating them, but I started when I was like 16 or 17 or something. And so India doesn't have that many literary magazines. And if there are literary magazines, they're localized. They're pretty localized. Like the print ones are pretty local. They do very small runs. It's very hard to get them. Or, I mean, there's no payment. There are suddenly a lot of online magazines in the last decade, but then I was growing up earlier than the last decade. So there weren't, I mean, I actually ran an online magazine out of WordPress at the turn of the century, I guess. And it was not big, but it was one of the first South Asian literary magazines coming out of South Asia. And it got like covered in newspapers, etc. a couple of times. It didn't last because we didn't know, like we were teenagers, we didn't know how to make money out of that thing. So so that wasn't there when I was growing up either. So what's largely missing in South Asia, I guess, and it's changing. It's also changing in Pakistan. Like Usman Tanveer Malik is getting, making infrastructures for younger people to, or newer people, not necessarily younger, to, short stories are a low stakes way of progressing, right? And when there isn't, like when your field doesn't have avenues where you can put out small sized works, then you basically write a whole novel on faith, right? And which basically means a lot of people don't really get the opportunity to improve with practice and feedback as you do when you have short stories. And you can, experiment with the form, and you can experiment with your voice, you can experiment with a lot of things in the public arena, right? And that doesn't happen. And also, the thing that I said about writing a whole novel on faith is a thing of privilege, which we don't always talk about. We don't always talk about when, there's an author who just like took 3 years of their life to write a novel. Who's paying your rent, bro? I mean, so I wrote poetry and I published them in the local, Calcutta has one big newspaper, and they had like this little culture section, which not many people who are not invested in it probably read. But then that newspaper, the Telegraph, also went to like 80% of the people's houses. So you're still, if you want, you can look at it, right? So I published a lot of that.
So talking about a little bit, sorry to, what you said
yeah.
about privilege was really important, because it's something that one comes across so much more in artistic spaces, because art is, to be able to have a voice, to be the person bringing forward a story, has its own form of privilege. You're there for a reason, and you're telling a story possibly because maybe someone else out there can't tell that story specifically for reasons connected to privilege. And that's true for so many storytellers. So I'm wondering, like, generally, like, this brings me to how you've talked about your own identity as a Dalit woman. You've talked about, and you've written this really beautifully in your article in Words Without Borders. You said, I write tonight about my stories and my language, but also about my life as a Dalit woman, for none of my context will ever be complete without that. You said that in one essay, and in other interviews, you've also said that, oftentimes you're very tired of answering Dalit-related questions and questions about your identity and your caste, and there's this constant push and pull when someone is from a marginalized community, is that you're expected to represent that, but you're also, it's intrinsic to the things you write about. So can you tell me a little bit about like how your thinking about your identity has evolved, as well as how you've integrated it into your work, and I guess the way you engage with it as you became a writer and found yourself as a writer?
What's true of a lot of us urban, at least middle class Dalit people from India, of my generation at least, is really captured very well in Yashika Dutt's book, which is called Coming Out as a Dalit. So many of our families, to different extent, basically raised our Dalit identity. Like, we were probably like the small strand of the family, like those of us who are middle class, we all have poor relatives, because like poor is the baseline that it's coming out of, right? So we're probably the most prosperous branch of the family. Like in my family, for instance, I am the most accomplished person ever in like generations, right? So, and this is something other Dalit writers have also talked about, and intellectuals, that when we're writing, we're often not talking about preserving legacy in a way, because our ancestors don't have legacy in those terms, right? Our ancestors are not like individually historically important figures. And so what happened for me is that I grew up in Calcutta, and I did not know any other Dalit people apart from my own family, really. And my parents both worked, and we're not super close, which is not a Dalit thing, it's just a thing. And I didn't communicate with them a lot, and I didn't particularly learn lessons from them about what the community is like. And given that they're not, like, when you're not educated in the social sciences, sometimes you can't express the condition of your community in precise terms, even if you're living them, right? So there were very few ways that my parents, like, they did not really give me the primer of like, this is how to live like a Dalit. But she, like my mother largely, she did tell me things like, Brahmins are bad, things like that, like Brahmins will treat you badly. And like, it's very hard to engage, or it's nuanced to engage with the intellectual conversation in Calcutta, because Calcutta does pride in being liberal. so often people would just deny being casteist because they would just say, well, I'm a liberal, I can't be that, right? So in Calcutta, the resistance necessarily becomes pretty intersectional, right? And so when my parents said that to me, and because I was being raised among largely upper caste friends and other people, I just basically said, well, no, people don't do that. Nobody does that to me. And it took a pretty long, like, I mean, at least late teenage or something, when I started realizing that people are dating in caste-based manners. Like even when they're like in this very liberal college where literally anybody can date anybody, or at least they're very strongly, talking about being that kind of liberal. But when they're choosing people to date, or people were also talking about being queer, like super big allies. But like the few friends that I had who were actually gay, who were not bisexual, who were not passing, did not have a good time. Like there was just massive amounts of microaggression. So every time I was whatever, like achieving something or the other, all these, not all this, but I mean, my college had a lot of dynasty kids, and it was pretty obviously expected that the best achievements of the community would always come from all these people who are from renowned families. And every time I did anything, reasonably admirable, I later heard that people would just basically be like, who does she sleep with? And like that would be the immediate assumption, that would be the immediate question, instead of considering that, maybe this person is talented and I never spoke to them, so I don't know. It would immediately be, who does she sleep with?
It kind of ties into things that I often hear about, this person from so-and-so background made it because of caste-based reservations or things like that, that they made it because of affirmative action kind of things, and not because they're actually talented, things like that. How did, in all these experiences, how did this affect the way you thought about your writing and your work, or did it at the time affect anything in your creative life? Did you pull anything from that or draw from that?
I think I have slowly come into that kind of writing. If you read them chronologically, you'll notice that they have gotten more consciously political over time. And that is a world that I've been writing for like 7 or 8 years, and I have kept building it. And it probably grew a little like, once again, one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, who wrote Discworld. And he wrote like 30 plus books in it without planning to. It just became a series, right? So you can see that world developing. Like if you see the early books, you can see that many parts of that world are not sketched out yet. And it just keeps getting richer and more layered. And I think that's what happened to my circus story world, because when I started writing them, probably in 2008 or something, when I was at college, I really did not know many other theories besides the first step, which is decolonizing, post-colonial theory. And post-colonial theory, largely, like my perspective on post-colonial theory now, is that post-colonial theory at that time when I was reading them was basically a theory of how to transfer power from the British masters to the local masters. And it doesn't go beyond, it doesn't talk about people who are non-masters in that community. And a lot of families like mine did not even notice independence happening. Like I later, when I like dug into my family history, not only my ancestors were not freedom fighters, anybody famous, there were also these like, super rural farmers who were, as you know about the British government's administration, like the upper level people were British, the lower level people were Indian, right? The Babus and so on, right? And so my ancestors, looking from the bottom up, were looking at an Indian oppressor, usually an Indian upper caste oppressor, right? And those people didn't go away. So the fact that the British went away somewhere from the cities or whatever, history is not even perceived the same way. And that is something you can see in a lot of African American theory. And you can see it in the writing of N.K. Jemisin, who's one of my other favorite authors. And she has talked about it, where she talks about, did Black people even experience history the same way? Like, the major historical events, are those major historical events in my whole world, right?
It is absolutely so essential what you just said, because one of my big questions to you was, you wrote about it again really brilliantly in that essay, where you said, like, you wrote in the same essay from Words Without Borders that that English saved my life, and that is not a fashionable thing to say in the post-colonial liberal arts circles of India. And then you also said, but in the post-colonial liberal arts circles of India, it's also not fashionable to be Dalit. And that was a very, very powerful line, because as you were saying, post-colonial theory seems to have erased what Gayatri Spivak called the subaltern. And so I'm wondering, like, can you talk a little bit about language and how, and like what you felt by asserting yourself through English, perhaps in reaction to these groups and these scholars that you're referring to?
I learned English from a dictionary. So my parents very functionally speak it, but they don't fluently. And I was the first kid in the family to go to an English medium school, but that Tagorian school was at that time not, like, they gave you English literacy, but not a lot of fluency. And it has changed. I mean, one of the conversations we should keep having about South Asia is that from decade to decade, the social situation changes a lot, right? And largely the economy is going upward. Not always, honestly, but so when I was growing up, I think I decided pretty early, like in 10th grade or something, like after the 10th grade, that I would go to the kind of school where, the kind of school whose name you could use to sound elite. And that was something I did before I got post-colonial theory. So sometimes, like, you live the experience, you don't have to know the theory too. So I knew that people were like looking down on me, and I was a very good student at that time. Like, when I was that young, I was even good at STEM, like, which nobody would believe right now. I've totally lost that part of my brain. And people would still just be weirdly disdainful, and my name and my whatever. And I decided that it would be a power move for me to always go to elite institutions so that I can use the institution's name next to me.
I want to talk a little bit about your work, especially the work that you brought up, His Footsteps Through Darkness and Light, The Trees of My Youth Grew Tall, This Sullied Earth Our Home. These are the three stories that I read, and I'm not sure I actually read them in chronological order. I think that this is what, for our viewers who haven't been introduced to your work, this is a collection of work that Mimi's put together that is, they're all loosely tied to each other through a circus, which is the majestic Oriental Circus, which I thought was an amazing name, because of because of how you depict Aladdin, and one of the acts in it is sort of very much tied to Orientalist visions of the Arabian Nights and the Muslim world. And I think that you really use that title in the circus to great effect. But generally speaking,
that title has become problematic, but different.
Do you want to talk a bit about that?
It's just the very American view on everything. So in America, Oriental means like East Asian, not Indian. And a lot of East Asian people in the science fiction community are not always happy that I have used the word Oriental to describe South Asians.
I mean, I can see that critique, but I also felt like in the context of a circus, there is so much of circus acts and those kinds of spaces that actually lean into the idea of Orientalism and tropes. People are in movies and all these things and all these sort of performances that one sees. The circus is always a place where stereotypes are drawn and expanded upon. And I felt like you did that in a very powerful way, to the extent that it wasn't stereotyping the characters, it was just showing a circus. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what drew you to the idea of putting together so many myths and mythologies and legends from different religions, from different communities, into the space of this, what you've called the majestic Oriental circus. What drew you to the circus generally as a space to set these stories in?
I'm probably part of the last generation of South Asians who actually saw circuses growing up when they were children. And I mean, I recently went to a circus maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and they have grown really decrepit. Like, they're not really working in South Asia that much anymore. So the circus is a very common trope, like in in science fiction fantasy, that kind of, the circus as a kind of liminal space is a very non-surprising trope. And I wanted to use that to just examine these crossings of boundaries in South Asia. And because it started as like this unplanned series, it doesn't actually, it did not come with like a very long-term vision. And the first story didn't have a circus. The first story is something that comes later in the chronology of the world, completely not planned at all. And it takes place in this slightly shady jazz burlesque bar that is by the riverfront in Calcutta, which did not really exist. Like I anachronistically picked up the 60s jazz scene. Like, India had a jazz scene right after independence, actually, or maybe it started before independence. And through the 50s and 60s, it existed in Bombay. There has been a movie about it called Bombay Velvet, which came later than my story, but my story wasn't that famous, so whatever. But I did not pick it from Bombay Velvet, but it's about exactly that same period. And it also existed a little bit in Calcutta, and then it didn't last very long. Because Bollywood largely absorbed a lot of other forms of entertainment in South Asia, in India largely, maybe not in South Asia entirely, because if you're in Pakistan or any of the other countries, you're still maintaining some national form of entertainment. But in India, pretty much all other forms of popular entertainment kind of collapsed into Bollywood in the 60s or something. Bollywood leached off the talents from the other mediums. Like, the other mediums still had fans, but they became not that popular, right? And it's not a bad thing. I'm not really saying it's a bad thing. Like, if there's a national cinema that draws from every other art form, it's not necessarily bad. The propaganda is bad. But so it happened in that jazz bar, and it's pretty much not political at all. And it had this character called Johari, who is being interviewed by the police. It's not called interviewed, is it? Over a crime. And the policeman asks him, so what's your background? And he says, well, I was born and raised in a circus, and I've only settled here the last few years. And so that stayed, and I picked off that background a few years later when I wanted to write a different story. And most of these stories keep happening in that background, partly out of laziness, because I have already built this reasonably, I've at least built the scaffolding of this world, so I can keep adding more people and more events to it.
I guess the elements of it, that this world that drew me so much into it, was just all the various mythologies you drew from. There's religious mythology. There's a Marid who's acting out stories from Islamic lore. there are Devadasis and angry gods, and then there's even a German character in one of your stories and you draw from more Western folklore. That's brilliant. Like, I don't know how you managed to bring all these people together, and you drew from so many different sources. So I'd love to get a sense of how did you start researching? Or did things just pop into your mind and you just scattered them throughout the stories? How did it go that way?
Okay, so one of the things that I'm not rich, and one of the things that I keep donating to actively is Wikipedia, because I have spent so many hours on it. Like, I've pretty much spent my life on Wikipedia and reading a lot of really, really random stuff. So I think I have I have a very big width of knowledge on little things, but I don't have enough depth. I spent pretty much my life picking up a lot of random things. So I guess the way my brain works is that I find those like large pattern connections, like a lot of interdisciplinary connections, as opposed to knowing very deeply on any one thing.
What really struck me in the story, amongst the stories that I read surrounding characters who are in the circus, was the one that didn't have as much of a connection to the circus, which is The Trees of My Youth Grew Tall. And that is a story that felt a little bit more rooted in realism, a little bit more rooted in, say, the typical post-colonial short stories, because you sort of start out with, you know, characters who come from a village to the city, and they have it seems to be like a world where the British still are there because the British took their lands. These are the tree folk, and they come into the city and they try to find work within their skill set. As tree folk, they can climb all kinds of buildings. They're very nimble on their feet. And then they encounter construction folk, who are another group of people who are like boxed into their own category because of their work or where they're based or where they're from. And so as you were writing this particular story, keeping in mind, like, you know, this sort of very realistic world that you're set in, but then the tree folk are very fantastical in their own way. They can climb anywhere. They almost have superhuman abilities. How did you strike this? How did you pull in the magical elements into what seemed to be a very realistic, very realism focused story? What did it come naturally? Did you make a special, I'm going to pull in some magical realism kind of elements? How did that work?
I mean, that totally was written when I was really beginning to learn to write outright fantasy, out of reading magical realism. So it's very magical realism, but it's also so I had a really hard time placing that story. It came out in Strange Horizons, but I put it through workshops and so on, and a lot of people said that there's no fantasy in it. There's nothing speculative in it. And I would go around telling people that this is technically anthropological fantasy, because human beings can't live on trees. Like, if you really want to go scientific about it, there is a reason why humans are not arboreal creatures. There are pretty much, if you go around looking at all the Aboriginal, etc., in human cultures, the whole range of the ways that humans can possibly live is being lived by somebody or the other, right? And being fully arboreal like monkeys has not happened, because humans can't be that. Our anatomies aren't built that way. So you can hunt from a tree or something, but you can't live on trees. So that is scientific. And so that is a departure from science, if you really want to get technical about it. But I mean, as many of us have discovered, that science fiction fantasy is not exactly an intellectual genre. The larger part of the readership is still people with a very teenage brain. So when they say science, they're thinking of flashy gadgets. They're not thinking of anthropology as science. Anyway, so one of the very common tropes in that story, if you really look at it, is the protagonist from a normal world being introduced to a fantasy world. So if you think of Harry Potter, for instance. Like he goes through Diagon Alley and he's like, somebody comes and finds him and he goes through this. And I really apologize for talking about Harry Potter because J.K. Rowling has not been a great person lately. But that's a very common reference for many other readers, right? So he is a person who has lived in a normal world, not knowing that there's a different world, right? And he walks through a portal. It's basically the portal fantasy trope, as more science fiction people say, that you go through from a normal world to a magical world and you learn that world. Like you are coming in as the ignorant person. And everybody has to, like, different people are giving you inputs in what's normal in this new world, right? And I basically reversed that trope as that old lady who is like the subaltern, and usually for the reader who's an urban person, the city would be the normal world, and that person's life would not. But you're looking from that person's perspective. So, the first thing she says, well, the city folk don't teach their children to climb. And you can see that climbing is normal for her, right? So it is the portal fantasy trope. It's just the portal fantasy trope turned around. She's coming into the city and she's like, these people don't do things the normal way, huh? Like, how do I navigate this space?
I was wondering what your thought process was it as you talked about her being the subaltern, about her identity as a mother, how she loses that identity and tries to regain it. Could you tell me a little bit about your thought process of writing her character?
She is, so all these stories, because they don't come with a plan, they're all like fan fictions of each other in a way. Like I am writing off the other stories. And in the first story where there's, like I said, that there's like this cabaret and bar, it's a bar being run by Johari, and it has some of these characters who have like survived the circus with him. Because you see the destruction of the circus, like you see the circus getting destroyed in his footsteps, right? This Kuldevi destroys the circus, and it's supposed to be that Johari goes and starts like this other business, and some of the circus people go with him, and then that is the first story, and every story kind of harkens back into that, like it adds material into that. And in that story, this is not entirely a spoiler. That's a murder mystery, like it's a murder mystery structure. So there's this cabaret, which is already very shady, and there are all these shady people who come there, and there's a murder in that cabaret. And a police officer has come in the morning, and like none of these people wake up in the morning, so they're getting interviewed by the police officer, interrogated. And to each of them, the police officer says, so what's your background? Who are you? And basically there are 4 or 5 people that the police officer interviews that you can see in the text. And they don't interview, at least in the text, like that old lady maid who works in the house. There's an old lady maid who, house domestic help who like cooks and cleans in the background. And that's in that story, that character doesn't really have a presence. Like there's just this domestic help, and all these other characters are interesting and speculative, right? So when I wanted to write, like when I wrote that story and I didn't write anything for 2 or 3 years, and then I wanted to write a couple of stories of other characters from there, I picked up there were these creepy plant twins, and the twins are there in the main story as well, first story. So I wrote a story about the twins, and then I wanted to write a story about that domestic help just as a very surprise element, because in the main story, you really, really don't look at the domestic help.
This is going back to more broader ideas of around writing and the inspirations you draw from. You wrote this really interesting piece for Scroll, where you critique the idea that it's cliche to pull from big Hindu epics like the Ramayana or Mahabharata. And so you ask this important question, which is, why is even all of Indian mythology just the Ramayana and Mahabharata? So I want to ask you, what defines Indian mythology?
I mean, nothing does really define mythology per se. And if you eventually, if I say it in a very barefaced way, it will sound weird. But then mythology eventually ends up becoming nationalistic narrative. And especially for a country like India, which exists over the same land that its majority religion emerged out of, right? Like, if I'm thinking about Pakistan, and like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, the larger population of Pakistan is Muslim, but the Islamic myths did not come from the same region, right? Like the main body of the Quran did not happen in that geographical region, right?
Definitely the Quran.
So,
Yeah, definitely the Quran.
so you're not using that narrative in the nationalistic manner. Like when you're building the narrative of the nation, you're taking other cultural elements, right? And ethnic elements and other things, right? So India benefits in a very weirdly monolithic way by claiming Hinduism from the center of it, right? And which is not even entirely true. And in India, it's very hard to do ancient history research. Like, it's, if you ever read this book called Early Indians by this author called Tony Joseph, which came out I think last year, not this year. He talks about how tremendously censored extremely ancient history research and archaeology is in India, because our right wing, and not even just our right wing, like this, the Congress has been doing this as well. So like our right and our center and our pretty much every nationalist, they don't want to dismantle the origin myth of Indians coming from India. They don't want to dismantle the Aryan myth, right? Which especially epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata are super, super embedded with, right? So a lot of our local cultural stories, and this is where you draw these, like, this is where you can see the semantic difference between mythology and folklore. I mean, why are some god stories mythology and some god stories folklore? And that really, really depends on how much political power they hold. So, I mean, Bengal, which is it's in the east, it's half of it is Bangladesh, and it's a pretty outlier. Like, Bengal used to be a pretty corridor region, right, to the southeast and to Southeast Asia, and through China and Tibet and so on. So I mean, Bengal has a lot of syncretic mythology, and we have a lot of like little gods and so on. We even Bengali Islam is very syncretic, right? And those things are called folklore. Why are those things not mythology? So we need to ask, what's the difference between mythology and folklore, and why?
Do you think the experiences of colonization have like divided up literatures and cultures way too much? Like, has it like, ultimately, would you say that us integrating into the English language as the way we're talking right now and the way we're writing, how do you think how has that affected our literature and how we relate to the world? It's something I constantly debate about and think about. I think in English so much, all these other things. Do you think that it's helped us or can we look at it without judgment necessarily?
There was at one point a movement to build like a language called Esperanto, which you may have looked at, which is apparently a language without history. And there was an effort made to teach everybody that, like, make that the language instead of English, the global language. And if you look at Esperanto, which I have, it looks like a West European language, whatever they pretend that it's not, but it looks like a mix of Spanish and Portuguese. And it was made by a white person, and they have taken out of like, Inuit language and like a lot of random. It is a colonial language in its mind. And the fact that they say that this language is without color is basically white people not being able to see color, right? And to say that people can be made to learn a language, the whole world can be made to learn a different language as opposed to the ones that they have already imbibed, is a first world white man not being able to look at, not being able to see the difficulties of so many other people's lives. Like seriously, who has the time to learn a language? All these like, people who barely can eat and so on, right? So I mean, while English has been imposed on us as an oppression, it's already there. We've learned it. Like, don't make us learn another thing. Like, the demand to force people to learn another thing itself comes from privilege. So, I mean, my question is, what better solution do we have? Give me a better solution. Don't give me the problem.
Yeah, that's a very good note to end on, because ultimately you cannot divorce language from history, from all the context, but you certainly can make it your own at the end of the day. But yeah, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting.